I still remember the exact sound that envelope made when it hit the bottom of my mailbox. Not a loud sound, just that stiff little slap certified mail always has, the kind that somehow makes your stomach tighten before you've even read a single word. I almost left it there because I figured it was another reminder from the homeowners association about my old shed or the color of my fence, something ridiculous I'd laugh about over dinner. But the moment I saw the bright red stamp that read Final Notice, I knew this one was different. I tore it open right there on my driveway, and by the time I reached the second page, my hands were shaking so hard I had to lean against my truck. They wanted $250,000, not $2,000, not $25,000. $250,000 in accumulated violations, penalties, legal fees, inspection costs, administrative charges, and enough made-up numbers to buy a decent house somewhere else. According to the letter, I had exactly 30 days to pay before they began legal proceedings to force the sale of my property. I remember looking around my yard thinking, for a faded blue shed, some river rocks around my flower beds, and a cedar fence that had weathered naturally because I hadn't stained it in a few years, I actually laughed for about 5 seconds because I thought somebody had to be pulling a prank. Then I looked up toward the neighborhood entrance where that polished stone monument proudly displayed the words Cedar Ridge Estates, and suddenly it wasn't funny anymore. I'd lived there for almost 18 years, long before most of my neighbors ever moved in. My parents had raised me just outside town, and after my father passed away, I bought back a piece of the old family property he'd always loved. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't some luxury estate, just a comfortable ranch house sitting on a little over 2 acres with enough room for a vegetable garden, a workshop, and a shed my dad and I built together the summer before cancer took him. Every crooked nail in that shed had a memory attached to it. Every board reminded me of his voice telling me to measure twice and cut once because lumber wasn't free. That's why every time the HOA sent me another violation notice demanding I tear it down because it wasn't architecturally compatible, I folded the letter in half and tossed it into a kitchen drawer. Looking back now, maybe that wasn't the smartest decision, but honestly, after years of being harassed over things nobody else seemed to care about, I'd stopped believing they had any real power. Then Olivia Mercer became HOA president. If you've ever met someone who mistakes authority for personality, you already know exactly who she was. Perfect hair every morning, expensive white SUV, clipboard always tucked under one arm like she was conducting military inspections instead of blocking suburban sidewalks. She didn't just enforce rules, she hunted for violations. She once measured my mailbox with a tape measure because she claimed it leaned 1 inch beyond community standards. Another time she sent me a warning because my tomato cages were visible from the street. My next-door neighbor, Walt, an 80-year-old retired firefighter, joked that she'd probably find God himself if the sunset wasn't in the approved color palette. We laughed, but underneath the jokes, everyone knew Olivia enjoyed making examples out of people who didn't bow to her. The funny thing was, most neighbors were decent folks. We'd wave while mowing our lawns, borrow ladders, help each other after storms. They weren't the problem. The board was. And Olivia had somehow convinced that board she was protecting property values by turning ordinary homeowners into permanent defendants. I drove straight to the HOA office after reading the letter. It sat inside a renovated clubhouse decorated with inspirational signs about community and respect, words that suddenly felt almost insulting. The receptionist looked nervous the moment she saw the envelope in my hand. "Is Olivia available?" I asked. She disappeared into the back office and came out a minute later holding the phone instead. "She'll speak with you, but only by phone." Even though she was maybe 20 feet away behind a closed door, I picked up the receiver and said, "Olivia, there has to be some mistake. I'm requesting a hearing." There was silence for a second, then a soft chuckle. "A hearing? Ethan, you've ignored 12 separate notices over 3 years. Because half of them were ridiculous. Ridiculous doesn't invalidate the covenanters. You're trying to take my house over paint that's faded in the sun." "No," she replied calmly. "We're taking your house because you believe the rules didn't apply to you." I could feel people in the office pretending not to listen. I lowered my voice. "My grandfather owned this land before Cedar Ridge even existed. My family was here decades before any HOA." She laughed again, only louder this time. "And now you're not. Times change. People like you don't fit neighborhoods like this anymore." Then, click, she hung up. I stood there staring at the receiver long enough for the dial tone to become a steady hum in my ear. That sentence kept replaying in my head all the way home. People like you don't fit here anymore. She had no idea how ironic those words were about to become. That night I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I climbed into the attic looking for old tax records that might help my attorney understand the property's history. Instead, buried beneath dusty Christmas decorations and a broken rocking chair, I found something I'd completely forgotten existed. A small green metal box wrapped in an old army blanket with my great-grandfather's handwriting still visible across a faded label. My father once told me never to throw it away because someday it might matter. At the time, I figured he was talking about family photographs. I had no idea that opening that box would change not only my life, but the future of every single house inside Cedar Ridge Estates. I carried that little green metal box downstairs like it was made of glass. Maybe it was the way my dad had talked about it years earlier. Maybe it was because Olivia's words were still echoing in my head, but something told me not to rush. I set it on the kitchen table, made myself a cup of coffee even though it was after midnight, and just stared at it for a minute before sliding the rusty latch open. The smell hit me first. Old paper, cedar, and that strange dry scent every attic seems to preserve forever. Inside were neatly folded letters tied together with faded twine. Several black and white photographs of men standing beside tractors I barely recognized. A leather notebook. And, beneath everything else, wrapped in wax paper, was a thick stack of legal documents with the words warranty deed typed across the first page. My great-grandfather, Samuel Carter. The year, 1948. At first, I honestly didn't understand what I was looking at. I read through the first few pages, then the next 10. Then started over because the legal language felt like another language entirely. But one phrase kept repeating itself. Perpetual easement. Another phrase. Mineral reservation. I wasn't a lawyer, but I knew enough to realize those weren't ordinary words. I called the only person I trusted with real estate matters. A local attorney named Rebecca Sloan. We'd met years earlier when she helped settle my father's estate, and she'd always struck me as someone who valued facts more than drama. When I called at 7 the next morning, she laughed when I apologized for asking her to review some old family paperwork. "Bring whatever you've got," she said. "Worst case, we spend an hour proving your grandfather liked collecting old documents." By 9:30, I was sitting across from her conference table while she carefully spread every page across the polished wood surface. She skimmed the first document with the relaxed expression of someone reviewing routine paperwork. Then she stopped. She leaned closer, picked up another page, walked over to a bookshelf and grabbed a thick county property reference book. 5 minutes later, she wasn't smiling anymore. "Rebecca?" I asked quietly. She didn't answer. Instead, she opened an online county database, entered several parcel numbers from the deed, compared maps from different decades, then slowly removed her reading glasses. "Ethan," she said, almost whispering, "where exactly did you say this box came from?" "My great-grandfather's attic. It stayed with my dad after he passed." She looked at me for another long second before letting out a laugh so unexpected it almost startled me. "Well, either somebody forged county records almost 80 years ago and somehow fooled every recorder's office since then." She paused. "Or your HOA just picked the worst possible homeowner in the entire state to bully." She turned the original survey map toward me. What had once been 400 acres had gradually been divided into residential lots over decades. But Samuel Carter hadn't sold everything. He'd retained perpetual underground mineral rights beneath every parcel and, even more importantly, permanent access easements across specific corridors running through what was now the entire Cedar Ridge subdivision. The easements had never been extinguished, never renegotiated, never legally abandoned. They had simply been forgotten. Rebecca pointed across the map with her pen. "See these lines? Every developer who bought portions of the property assumed these rights would eventually be released. They never were." "So, what does that actually mean?" She leaned back. "It means every property owner technically purchased their home subject to your family's recorded rights." I blinked. Including the HOA clubhouse." She pointed again. "Including the entrance monument." Another point. "Including Olivia Mercer's own property." I honestly didn't celebrate. I just sat there trying to process what I was hearing because it sounded impossible. Rebecca must have seen the confusion on my face because she smiled. "Don't misunderstand. This doesn't mean you suddenly own everyone's backyard. But it does mean the association has been acting as though it controls land where your recorded property interests still legally exist. If they've interfered with those easements or restricted your lawful use without addressing your rights." She shrugged. "They've created a serious legal problem for themselves." The next week became a blur of county offices, title companies, surveyors, and document requests. Every time I expected someone to tell us the paperwork was outdated or invalid, they came back with the same answer: recorded, active, never released. One elderly county survey technician actually smiled when he saw Samuel Carter's signature. "Haven't heard that family name in years," he said. "Your great-granddad was known for documenting everything. Man trusted paper more than people." Rebecca filed 3 separate actions over the following 48 hours. One asserted enforcement of the recorded easement rights. Another requested judicial recognition of the mineral reservation. The third alleged repeated interference and covenant violations by the homeowners association itself. Then we waited. We didn't have to wait long. 72 hours later, sheriff's deputies arrived at the HOA office carrying official court papers. Walt called me before lunch. "Buddy, fifth," he laughed into the phone. You should have seen Olivia's face. She looked like somebody unplugged her soul. By evening, the entire neighborhood Facebook page had exploded with rumors. Some claimed I was trying to seize everyone's homes. Others insisted the HOA was about to dissolve. A few accused me of inventing fake documents. I ignored every comment. Rebecca warned me that public arguments could only complicate things. "Let the paperwork speak," she kept saying. "Facts age better than emotions." A week later, Olivia finally called me herself. No laughter this time. "Ethan," she said stiffly, "perhaps we can discuss a compromise. I asked for a hearing 3 weeks ago. Circumstances have changed." "No," I replied calmly. "The circumstances stayed exactly the same. The only thing that changed is you finally learned the truth." She went quiet before saying, "Our attorney is reviewing your claims." "Good. You understand this could become expensive for everyone." I couldn't help smiling. "It already has." By day 12, the HOA had hired one of the largest property law firms in the county. Rebecca later told me their lead attorney requested copies of every original deed, survey, amendment, and county recording. 3 days later, he called her personally. "They're authentic," he admitted. "We've verified every filing. County officials confirmed it. The title insurer confirmed it. Independent surveyors confirmed it. Even the developer's archived records acknowledged the original Carter reservations, though apparently everyone assumed they had been resolved decades earlier. They never were." Rebecca drafted a single email and asked if I wanted to soften the language. I read it twice before shaking my head. "No threats," I said. "Just facts." The message contained 3 options. First, revoke every outstanding fine, lien, penalty, and enforcement action against my property. Second, permanently exempt my land from every HOA restriction through a recorded covenant recognized by the county. Third, compensate me for years of documented interference with the easement rights through a structured settlement rather than prolonged litigation. If those terms were rejected, we would ask the court to enforce every legal remedy available under state property law, including injunctions affecting the association's access corridors and common areas. Rebecca pressed send. "Now," she said, closing her laptop, "we let them decide whether pride is worth more than reality." They tried holding emergency board meetings almost every night that week. Neighbors who had never attended HOA meetings before suddenly packed the clubhouse parking lot. Nobody really knew what was happening, but people sensed something was very wrong. Walt called after one meeting and said, "They're not arguing about you anymore. They're arguing with each other." Apparently, several board members had never been told about the legal opinions arriving from their own attorneys. Olivia had insisted everything was under control while quietly spending thousands of dollars from HOA funds trying to prove the Carter documents were fraudulent. Instead, every expert she hired reached the exact same conclusion. The documents weren't the problem. She was. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I realized I wasn't just defending my shed or my fence anymore. I was watching the foundation of the entire HOA begin to crack under the weight of its own arrogance. And judging by the angry conversations spreading across Cedar Ridge, Olivia Mercer was about to discover that frightened homeowners can forgive a lot, but they almost never forgive someone who gambles with their homes while hiding the truth. 3 days after we sent that email, I got another phone call from Olivia. This time, there wasn't a trace of confidence left in her voice. No rehearsed speeches, no condescending little laughs, no reminders about community standards. Just silence, followed by a tired sigh. "Ethan," she said quietly, "what would it take to make this go away?" I looked out the kitchen window toward the old shed my father and I had built all those years ago. Funny how that little building had somehow become the center of a legal fight neither of us could have imagined. I already told you, I answered. I'm not trying to destroy anybody. I just want what should have happened from the beginning. Admit you were wrong. Leave my property alone. Stop treating homeowners like revenue sources. She hesitated before saying, you have to understand. The board trusted my judgment. I couldn't stop myself. No, Olivia. They stopped questioning it. She didn't argue because deep down she knew I was right. The emergency HOA meeting that Saturday night was unlike anything Cedar Ridge had ever seen. Cars filled every parking space. People stood along the sidewalks holding folding chairs. Neighbors who had never spoken during meetings suddenly demanded microphones. Rebecca attended with me but reminded me not to say much. Tonight isn't about convincing anyone, she whispered. Tonight is about letting them ask the questions they've been avoiding. Olivia opened the meeting with a carefully written statement claiming the association was simply dealing with an unexpected historical title dispute. That lasted less than 2 minutes before someone in the back stood up. It was Walt, 80 years old, leaning on his cane, but his voice carried through the entire room. Tell them how much you've spent fighting, Ethan. The room went silent. Olivia tried to move to the next agenda item. Then another homeowner raised her hand. No. Answer him. Someone else shouted. Tell us what our dues paid for. The association treasurer, who looked like he hadn't slept in days, slowly slid a binder across the table. I think everyone deserves to see this. Olivia reached for it, but he pulled it back. No, they really do deserve to see it. One page after another revealed outside legal invoices, consulting contracts, investigation fees, private inspection companies, and executive compensation that most homeowners had never known existed. Then came the number that changed everything. $93,000. Annual compensation and discretionary benefits approved for the HOA president over several years, while dues continued climbing and residents were told the association couldn't afford basic maintenance. The room exploded. People weren't angry because of me anymore. They were angry because they suddenly realized every warning letter, every petty citation, every unnecessary violation had helped justify a system that rewarded harassment. One neighbor admitted she'd paid thousands to replace perfectly healthy landscaping after being threatened with legal action. Another confessed he refinanced part of his mortgage just to satisfy escalating fines over a basketball hoop. A young couple said they'd postponed having their first child because special assessments kept draining their savings. Story after story poured out until it no longer sounded like isolated complaints. It sounded like a pattern. Olivia kept insisting everything had been approved according to procedure. But procedure suddenly didn't matter. Trust did. And trust had disappeared. The vote happened almost an hour later. Dissolve the existing board. Commission an independent audit. Negotiate settlement under the terms proposed by my attorney. One by one, hands went up across the room. Then more. Then, nearly all of them. The final count wasn't even close. Olivia looked around the clubhouse like she expected someone to rescue her, but nobody did. She quietly removed the president's nameplate from the table, placed it inside her folder, and walked out the side door without saying another word. 60 days later, a moving truck backed into her driveway before sunrise. Most people watched through their windows, not because they hated her, but because they couldn't believe the woman who once acted like she owned the neighborhood was leaving it without so much as a farewell. As for me, every violation disappeared from the county record. The threatened foreclosure was withdrawn. A permanent recorded agreement exempted my property from future HOA authority, and the settlement ensured nobody could revive those same restrictions years down the road under a different board. Life slowly became ordinary again, which turned out to be the greatest victory of all. Kids rode bicycles without worrying about anonymous complaint letters. Neighbors started talking over fences instead of through attorneys. Walt still wandered over every Friday afternoon just to complain about baseball and drink coffee on my porch. The shed stayed exactly where it had always been. The cedar fence faded a little more every year. The river stones around my garden never moved an inch. Sometimes, I still walk into that old shed and run my hand across one of the beams my father nailed into place. It's funny, everyone thinks the old metal box saved my home, but that's not really true. The box didn't save anything. It simply reminded me that history has a way of protecting people who refuse to forget it. Olivia once told me people like me didn't belong in neighborhoods like Cedar Ridge. Looking back now, maybe she was right. Because neighborhoods aren't supposed to belong to people who chase power. They're supposed to belong to the families who build memories there, raise children there, bury parents there, and refuse to let fear become another monthly bill. So now I have a question for you. If you discovered old family documents proving you had the legal upper hand, would you have fought the HOA the way I did? Or would you have taken the first settlement they offered and walked away? I honestly want to hear your answer because people are still divided over whether I defended my home or went too far. Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you enjoy stories where ordinary people stand up to abuse of power, make sure you subscribe because I've got another unbelievable story coming next.